For instance, when he said forgive, he didn't just say forgive one time, he said forgive 70 times 7, right? So Christ was amplifying the law. In other words, there were the 10 commandments, and then Christ came to uh, accentuate or to uh, extend, to give us an example of how far reaching the law was. Not that he came to do away with the law. So why would it be, any reasonable person would say, well, if God is the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow, if there has been a pattern, if there has been a design laid out by God, a plan laid out by God, um, would he then all of a sudden change it? Well, not if we believe that he's consistent. Not if we understand that he's immutable, not changeable. He's not going to deviate from his law. In other words, if there is a law of gravity, what goes up must come down, right? Well, is God going to suddenly just change that? And if he did, would that add to some confusion? Because remember, God is not the author of confusion. God is not the author of lies. God is not the author of deception. Everything that God has done and throughout the scriptures is a repeat, is a pattern that was laid out, and his pattern is consistent, and he is consistent in carrying out his plan. And if for nothing else that you observe throughout the scriptures, I think that that would be a main theme. In fact, the scriptures that I'm going to present to you tonight, and that we will use in furtherance of our understanding of God's pattern, is, and I think we spoke about, the pattern of the Garden of Eden, and the pattern of the tent and the tabernacle, and the elements that were involved uh, last week and the week before. So I want to talk about now the pattern of the wilderness and the pattern of the garden. And the pattern of the wilderness and the garden are not just meant for Adam's time and Moses' time, the time of the Israelites, but it also is a pattern for us now, in this very present day, and as well in the future as we approach the end of days. And we will discuss in detail that pattern. And so with that, I would like to give you the scriptures that are, remember, the scriptures, Luke, Matthew, Mark, and Matthew that I gave you, are a sort of a foundation, or are maybe the end result of where we're going. But these scriptures that I'm going to list for you now are developing the pattern of the wilderness and how that relates to our walk with God, our lives, and for us now in present times, and then the pattern that will become apparent for us in coming days and toward the end of days. So let me list for you those scriptures. First, we're going to start with um, Exodus 14. Exodus 14 and 15, and in your spare time you can read about the trip that the Israelites took from Egypt with the Pharaoh on through to the wilderness. And as you're reading about that, try to picture what the wilderness would have been like. And if I can take a moment to emphasize. Remember, in the Garden of Eden, everything was there for them. The garden was plush, lush, full of good fruits. The atmosphere was just right. As I've talked about before, it wasn't too hot, wasn't too cold. Uh, they had everything they needed. It running, I think there were 4 rivers that are described for the Garden of Eden. So we know that it was very bountiful. There's plenty of water, plenty of good air, plenty of good food. Again, very comfortable surroundings. Everything that they needed was provided for them. And during the time that the people were sent to the wilderness, or went to the wilderness, we call it the wilderness, and the Bible speaks of it as wilderness. But if you go back in uh, any documents, you will find that the desert at that time, though we call it a desert or we refer to it as the wilderness, it it had much more vegetation then than it does now. Uh, there are pictures of Sodom and Gomorrah, that area, and they have recently discovered it and shown a documentary on it, in fact. And they show it now as barren, just nothing there. Nothing can grow there. It's hot, it's dry. But prior to that, many of the areas throughout the quote wilderness were lush. They had rivers going through them. In fact, they have found now uh, the 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 seabed or the riverbeds that used to run through certain parts of the wilderness or the desert, and they have become the desert, is what I'm getting you to see. And the reason that they have become the desert is because of what occurred there. You know, if you have an opportunity to look at a lot of the places in Africa, you will find that Africa is probably one of the richest in terms of resources: diamonds, gold, cadmium, lithium, all kinds of resources that are there, that are many different countries are now, going in and just and pillaging um, the land for all that it has, oil, etc. Uh, but there was at one time very lush, rich terrain there, full of lots of vegetation, foliage, many different animals, the various rivers, etc. These places were at one time very lush and rich and full of life and vitality and provided. It has only been in our modern time, in the recent times, I would say the last, 200 years. And remember, 200 years is not even, you know, is nothing in comparison to 1,000 years, right? Or 5,000 years. But in our recent time, that's when a lot of the deserts really became deserts, dry, almost uninhabitable. So we need to not think of the wilderness or the desert as we see it in its present form, but as in the way God had originally designed these spaces, these areas. So, Exodus 14 and 15, and then Isaiah 64 and 10, Luke 5 and verse 16, Matthew 3 and 1. We'll talk about the wilderness. And oddly enough, you will find that the wilderness is spoken of in the book of Revelation in several passages, and we will look at Revelation 12, 6 through 14, Isaiah 51, 1 through 8, Ezekiel 34, 24 through 31, Hosea 2:14 through 20, Revelation 15:3 to 20, Ezekiel 20, Matthew 7:21 through 27, Matthew 19:7, and Isaiah 35:1 through 4 and 5 through 10, or 1 through 10. And we will begin to see, as we explore those scriptures, a very beautiful pattern that is revealed to us of this place of the wilderness. You will come to see that the wilderness is not just this harsh, dry setting, but it is also a place where Zion will be. Do you know? Are you familiar with Zion? Zion is what the Bible refers to as the holy city, the New Jerusalem. And Revelation speaks of how God will bring about the new heaven and the new earth, the New Jerusalem, and that the heaven will come down with God into, or to, the new earth, to the new place that he has prepared, that he will prepare. But it also speaks about the woman. Now remember, there are two women in Revelation. One is the woman with blasphemy, and one is the woman that's used figuratively to talk about the woman who brings forth the man-child. In this instance, we're talking about the Messiah. And it speaks about the woman being placed in the wilderness with all of the comforts that she needs as a way of protection. Now, I bet you never really gave thought to the fact that the Israelites were leaving slavery. They were leaving oppression, and they were going into the wilderness. While they were in the wilderness, the quote wilderness, the desert, during that whole 40-year time, they never had to replenish anything. You ever really thought about that? Everything was there, provided for them. When they needed water, ultimately Moses hit the rock and water was provided. When they needed food, God provided manna. When they asked for meat, God provided quail. And you never hear them speaking of how things wore out. You know, they weren't constantly running to Walmart and buying new shoes. All those things were provided, and it was all there. And then this other aspect of the wilderness, when in Revelation, when the woman is told to go to the wilderness, a place that was prepared for her, it's prepared for her protection. Now, were not the Israelites leaving slavery, oppression, going into freedom? And where were they ultimately heading? To the land of milk and honey. The land Canaan. You remember, part of the desert, or what we would consider today, desert land, wilderness. But it had provided for them everything. The grapes were much larger. Took 2 men to carry the bundle of grapes. So things were in abundance. We sometimes think of wilderness as, such a horrible place. But if in fact the Bible says in Isaiah 64:10 that Zion is in the wilderness, we're talking about the tabernacle of God